I would not go back on any of the commitments that the government has made, but I would certainly reform Social Security in a way that would end in its ultimate elimination.
Well, you're not afraid then of the free market under any circumstances, where cooperation, which you find necessary or which you believe always comes, fails to come, where competition becomes so fierce and becomes very frequently corrupt, and where it becomes stupid. Take, for example, what's happening in today's market, the conglomerates, which have been seizing up all sorts of... We happen to live in a hotel that's run by a conglomerate. Why should ITT, for example, run a hotel? And how are you going to stop that?
Well, first place, once again...
Without government, without some government intervention.
It's government measures that have promoted the conglomerates. The major reason we have conglomerates is because they are a very effective way to get around a whole batch of tax legislation. Let me ask a different question. Who is more affected by government regulations, by government controls?
I thought I was supposed to ask the questions. But I was warned that you might turn these on me.
But tell me, who's more affected? The big fella, who can deal with it, who can have a separate department to handle the red tape, or the poor fella?
Well, the big fella can always take care of himself under any system.
Right. And therefore, you want a system which gives the big fella the least advantage. And the system under which he can get government to help him out gives him the most advantage, not the least. You say, am I afraid of greed, of lack of cooperation? Of course. But we always have to compare the real with the real. What are the real alternatives? And if we look at the record of history, if we go back to the 19th century, which everybody always points to as the era of the robber baron who strode around the land and ground the poor under his heel, what do we find? The greatest outpouring of voluntary charitable activity in the history of the world. This University of Chicago is an example. It was founded by contributions by John D. Rockefeller and other people. The colleges and universities throughout the Midwest. If you go back and ask when was the Red Cross founded, when was the Salvation Army founded, when were the Boy Scouts founded, you'll discover all of that came during the 19th century in the era of unregulated, rapacious capitalism.
Milton, I'd like to go back for a minute to the question of conglomerates. Granted that what you say, that the government policies, concentration of central government, if you will, or whatever you want to call it, are responsible for the growth of conglomerates. What should you do about them now?
No
should
doubt.
Government try to undo them? Or should anybody try to undo them?
No.
Or should you just let them fail? What would you
You
do?
should let them fail, of course. I am strongly opposed to government bailing any of them out. You should let them fail. The best things you can do, in my opinion, are first to have complete free trade, so you can have conglomerates in other countries compete with conglomerates in this country. We may have only 2 or 3 automobile companies, but there's Toyota, there's Volkswagen. Competition from abroad is effective. But in the second place...
And when you say complete free trade, you mean all over the world?
No, sir. I mean the United States all by itself, unilaterally, should eliminate all trade barriers. We would be better off if all the other countries did the same.
What do you think would happen if we just did it, though?
I think we'd be very much better off, and a lot of others would then follow our example. That's what happened in the 19th century when Great Britain in 1846 completely removed unilaterally all trade barriers. So that
You don't think this country would be flooded with goods of all kinds from all over the world, maybe cheaper, and that we wouldn't have great unemployment?
What would the people who sold us goods do with their money? They'd get dollars. What would they do with the dollars? Eat them? If they want to send us goods and take dollars in return, we're delighted to have it. No, that's not a problem as long as you have a free exchange rate, because we cannot export without importing. We cannot import without exporting. You would not have a reduction in employment. What you would have would be a different pattern of employment. You'd have more employment in export industries and less employment in those industries that compete with import. But go back to conglomerates, Larry, for a moment. I just want to ask a very different kind of a question. Conglomerates are not very attractive. I would much rather have a lot of small enterprises. But there's all the difference in the world between a private conglomerate and a government conglomerate. In general, the government conglomerate can get money from you without your agreeing to give it to them. You and I pay for Amtrak and for the postal deficit, whether we use the services of Amtrak or the postal deficit or not. I don't pay your conglomerate unless I rent one of their apartments. I get something for my money.
So bad as private conglomerates are, they're less bad than one of the alternatives.
Well, suppose I agree with almost everything you say and say it would be wonderful if we were starting from scratch.
Almost everything I say, you're a unique human being.
I didn't say I do. I don't say I do agree, but I said suppose I agree for the sake of argument. We can't start from scratch.
No.
How do we undo what we have? How do we undo what we have done?
That's the hardest.
How would you undo it? Not me.
That's the hardest problem, and I agree. That is the real question. How do we get from where we are to where we want to go? And we can't get there overnight. We cannot get there by simply eliminating the things that should not have been done. As in the case of Social Security, we have it, and we've got to live up to our obligations. So we do have to develop a series of policies which will enable us gradually to move from where we are to where we want to be. The first and most important step, in my opinion, is to stop moving in the wrong direction.
Milton, you said a few minutes ago that throughout the free world the public is coming to recognize the danger of big government and is taking steps to control it. But how, with the example of what freedom does before them, how do you explain the new countries that have been coming up, all going in the direction of dictatorship?
The intellectual climate of opinion has an enormous influence on what happens. And the popular intellectual attitude within the free countries for the poor countries has been that they have to have centralized government. And that has served the interests of small elite groups within those countries. In one backward country after another, what has happened as they've gotten their freedom supposedly from colonial rule, you've had a small elite take over. And they have run that country for their own benefit and at the expense of the poor. It's a tragedy of the modern era. Change the climate of opinion in the major countries. As the climate of opinion is changing, as the philosophy, the attitude, what's being taught at the universities is different. And you will see that these other countries, these backward countries, will follow it. And there is some evidence that way. If you look at the countries the backward countries which are doing best for themselves, they are places like Hong Kong, like Singapore, like Taiwan, like Korea. They're not free countries in our sense of the term, but they have much larger elements of freedom, much greater scope for individual initiative than do many of the other countries of the world which have gone much farther in the communist, centralized, controlled direction.
How the Singapore, for example, and Taiwan have had, you say, very free economies. Now, how do their economies remain free, but their politics and their human freedom is still curtailed, and as I understand, in many cases, rather severely curtailed? They don't have any of the freedoms we have: press, religion.
Economic freedom is a necessary condition for all human freedom, but it's not a sufficient condition. You can have an economy that's largely free, with large elements of restrictions. For example, let me take the American experience. Before the Civil War, we had a mixture of a largely free economy with a segment of the population, the slaves, held in a condition of involuntary servitude. But even where you don't have complete political freedom, in the case of a Singapore or a Taiwan, human beings are much freer than they are in those societies where there is no economic freedom either. If you compare the conditions of people in a place like Singapore with the conditions of people in a place like Red China, or for that matter in Indonesia, you will see that the economic freedom is a very important component of total freedom. It's not something different. It's not something separate. Economic freedom is part of total freedom, and for most people it's the most important part. Freedom doesn't mean very much to a starving man. And if a free society could not help the starving man, it would be very difficult for it to remain free very long. That's why the ability of a free society to improve the lot of the ordinary person is a very, very necessary condition for its remaining free, but it's not the fundamental reason why I want a free society. I want a free society for the human and ethical and moral values that you stressed as appertaining to freedom. Freedom really rests, the value of freedom.
Yeah, but suppose the moral values mean a lot to me, but again, as I say, they mean nothing to the man who's hungry.